This is a CBC podcast. Enter the world of Jonathan Goldstein. Season 8 of Wiretap is now available for purchase on iTunes. Relive this past season's funny, sad, wistful, and slightly strange telephone conversations with Jonathan's friends and family. Get it now at cbc.ca/iTunes.
Hello, I'm Matthew Lazenrider, and this is The Invisible Hand. This is a show about economics, the choices we make every day about how to spend our money, our time, and all our other resources. Our choices can be influenced by a lot of things. One of the most powerful, the incentive. Think of it as a reward, that little prize you get for picking the best course of action. But sometimes, incentives cause people to act in ways we don't expect. Today on The Invisible Hand, what happens when good incentives go bad? If you look at the idea of the invisible hand, it was thought up in the 18th century by Adam Smith. He believed that when people act in their own self-interest, they can end up working toward a greater good for everyone. But even he never thought that a whole lot of people willy-nilly doing their own thing could make everything in the world work perfectly. That's why governments and organizations often step in when they see things going off track. Sometimes they just make a law to change people's behavior and say, you must do this or you must do that. But sometimes they use a different approach. Instead of issuing an order, they offer a reward.
Students applying for the fall can get 15% of their tuition back. It's part of the school's plan to tackle a problem where kids are dropping out of school while only halfway through their degree.
It started as a simple idea. Pull cars like this one off the road and recycle them. Owners took a $300 cash incentive for cutting emissions.
Ontario's Premier is offering a rebate to anyone who buys an electric car or plug-in hybrid starting next summer.
The old carrot and stick approach is just one classic example of incentives at work, something to change up the equation when you calculate the best choice for the best result. But most economists will tell you that incentives don't have to be something material, like a carrot or a tax credit. They don't even have to be created on purpose. And sometimes, the positive power of the incentive turns perverse. Those times are crucial to the study of economics. The unexpected outcomes can help economists and policymakers plan better in the future. And that's why today's show will focus on the perverse incentive. Okay, let's get down to the basics. In economic terms, what is an incentive and why should we care?
If you're a microeconomist, which is what I am, I think incentives are everything.
That incentive-centric microeconomist is Frances Woolley. She teaches at Carleton University in Ottawa.
I think the basic principle of economics is that people aren't stupid. They have a certain set of things they want, and they do their best to get what they want. And incentives are basically anything that rewards a particular set of behavior. I mean, in a sense, the study of economics is the study of incentives, the way that people react and respond to the world around them, the way people make choices. You know, this job pays well, this job doesn't pay so well, this is an expensive way of doing things, this is a cheap way of doing things. So the incentives are really the forces around us, the economic forces around us that structure our lives. So for me, incentives are, in a sense, everything.
So Frances Woolley says incentives are everything. They have a powerful effect on how people make decisions. That's why, she says, they've become a favorite tool for governments and others looking to make change, and why the people in charge really need to think through any incentives they're creating.
Canada prides itself on kind of being a kinder, gentler society. And I think your typical Canadian is proud of the fact that we have less income inequality than the United States, and that we are, in some sense, a more equal society, which is a good thing. It's a good thing to support people in need. But as soon as the government tries to provide support for people in need, there's the tension that I think anybody who's concerned with social justice, concerned with having a good society, has to really struggle with these issues, right? How to structure incentives so that the vulnerable people in our society are cared for, but at the same time, creating incentives for work and effort and for people to reach prosperity.
Frances points out that Canadians pride themselves on helping people in need. Along with other supporting social programs, policymakers here can use incentives to help support that goal. For example, they can encourage people to support local charities by giving donors a tax break. The charities get extra financial support, and along with the satisfaction of helping their community, donors have the added incentive of having some of their costs covered. Of course, different governments at different times will have different priorities. They can tailor the right incentive to help them reach that goal. Sometimes, the right incentive is actually a disincentive.
Disincentive. Noun. A deterrent. Something that causes or that could cause a person to decide not to do something.
Let's look at an example of a government with a priority to make things safer for its citizens. In 1994, the state of California decided to get tough on career criminals. It brought in legislation that became known as the 3 Strikes Law. It works like this. If someone's been convicted of 2 serious felonies, their next felony conviction, serious or not, gets them 25 years to life in prison. The law was intended to create a disincentive for criminals. Do not commit crime after crime because you will pay dearly.
Where I live, I literally have to pass by my father's job where he was killed. And there's not a day that goes by that I don't think of him, and I can't not have the thought of him and him not being here without thinking of the guy who took him from us.
Vanessa Wellington's father was killed by a repeat offender right around the time California's 3 Strikes Law was brought in. In fact, the murderer was actually out on parole at the time he shot Vanessa's father, Herbert Stovall.
We lost, a great father, a great mentor. My son, who is 10 and a half, never got to meet his grandfather. It's just a void. It's been a void ever since he's been gone.
Since the time of Herbert Stovall's death, 9,000 so-called third strikers have been locked up in California prisons. Bill Jones was Secretary of State for California when Proposition 184 was written. He helped draft the law.
It's been the most successful criminal justice legislation that California has ever seen. The reduction in crime has been dramatic. 3 strikes has worked because deterrence does work if the message is clear. And if either the law enforcement community or the district attorney or you or I or anyone else gets in the way of the message that 3 strikes is delivering to that repeat offender, all they're going to do is put more people at risk.
So some people point to the habitual offender law as a success. It was meant to make people safer by creating a disincentive for 2-time offenders to commit 1 more crime. But as we mentioned off the top, this episode of The Invisible Hand isn't just about what happens when incentives work. It's also about how perverse incentives can show up where they're least expected. So you can bet we'll be coming back to this story by the time we end the show. I'm Matthew Lazenrider, and you're listening to The Invisible Hand on CBC Radio 1 and across North America on Sirius 159. You can check out our webpage at cbc.ca/theinvisiblehand. Now it's time to get back to our discussion about something called perverse incentives.
Incentives are basically anything that rewards a particular set of behavior.
That is Carleton University economist Frances Woolley reminding us about what an incentive is. We've also talked about disincentives, things that deter behaviors. And now it's time to introduce you to one other kind of incentive: the perverse incentive.
A perverse incentive gives people an incentive to engage in some behavior which is really quite undesirable. The Soviet Union and communism, there's some wonderful examples. Under the communist system, people had, all firms had production targets. So they were told, okay, you have to manufacture so many tons of nails, right? Well, you can see that this kind of causes a problem, right? Because if your production target is so many tons of nails, what people do is they make just enormously huge, heavy nails, right? Now, this is a problem. So really, a perverse incentive is when the behaviors that are created are really intrinsically very undesirable.
Economists like Frances are fascinated by the effects of perverse incentives. When you offer a reward for some behavior, you have to have a way to measure success. If you measure the wrong thing, like in Frances's example, weight, you end up with big, useless nails. But on the flip side, if you offer a reward for the number of nails, you might just end up with piles and piles of teensy tiny little pushpins. That's just one example of how incentives can turn perverse. And these examples can help us make better policies, so that our interventions actually do keep things in the economy, in society, running smoothly. Another good example to learn from dates back to French colonial Asia. Mike Van is not an economist, but he's pretty well placed to tell us the tale of what he calls the Hanoi Rat Massacre. Mike is the vice president of the French Colonial Historical Society, and he picks up this story somewhere in the early 1900s.
There's always been rats in Vietnam, obviously. Prior to the advent of the modern sewers, the rats are in shop houses, up in the roofs, in homes, and so forth. But with the construction of the sewers, you have a brand new ecosystem being created, full of all sorts of nasty, yucky things rats like to eat and chew on and roll around in. And the sewers also provided a transportation system through the French neighborhoods. And especially the sewers gave them access to the homes, to those French villas.
So the rats were getting into the homes of the French colonists. So something had to be done. That something was an incentive, a bounty on rats.
So they asked the Vietnamese population to look for rats and to kill them and to bring them in. Well, for having them bring dead rats into the town hall, there'd be piles and piles of dead rats. And obviously, if you can pull 20,000 rats out of the sewer in a single day, you're going to be overwhelmed with rat corpses. So someone had the bright idea, well, let's just have them bring in the tails of the rats. They'll kill the rat, cut off the tail, bring in the tail. And the operation is a great success. They're giving about a penny per rat. And for a few months, this seems to be going really well. Until one health official notices in the Vietnamese neighborhood that there's a lot of rats running around who don't have tails.
And this is where the tale turns from one of a simple rat bounty to a story of a perverse incentive.
Then things go from bad to worse when one of the health officials is out in the suburbs of Hanoi, just outside the French city limits, and he sees a rat farm. And evidently the local population, understanding market forces, turn to raising rats, chopping off their tails, bringing them in for the bounty, and then continuing breeding the rats in the farms. Well, I'm sure there were many cries of Mon Dieu and Sacre Bleu and other French terms of frustration. The whole project failed completely and actually led to an increase in rat population. A classic case of perverse incentive, where you put out an economic incentive and it has the absolute opposite consequence.
That fits in pretty well with our economist's definition. Frances Woolley might not talk about it in terms of rats, but she's got another pesky critter she uses to describe the perverse incentive.
Whack-a-mole. You're a policymaker and you see a problem. So what you do is you try and whack that problem in the head with some kind of a policy. And then another mole pops up, right? One of the better known examples of perverse incentives is the CAFE standards in the U.S.
In case you're wondering, the CAFE in CAFE standards stands for Corporate Average Fuel Economy. Back to you, Frances.
They were designed to have minimum fuel economy standards for cars. The problem is these CAFE standards were kind of expensive, right? To make. Well, so the auto manufacturers took a good look at the rules, right? And they realized these standards didn't apply to trucks. So you could avoid having to comply with all these regulations if you just built trucks, like really comfortable trucks, and called them, say, sports utility vehicles, right? And that's actually where the SUV came from. automakers attempting to avoid these restrictive standards that were placed on cars by building vehicles that weren't subject to these requirements, right? So it's the whack-a-mole. You used to say, okay, well, cars are inefficient, right? So you whack that mole, and then up pops these massively, monstrously inefficient sports utility vehicles.
So the policy was intended to make cars more efficient. The result was more gas-guzzling light trucks. All right, rats, moles, any other animals we ought to bring into the discussion about perverse incentives?
Yeah. Oh, well, I love dogs. And I think, to me, when we say about incentives, it's about structuring the rules, creating institutions that allow people to have good lives. And it's also about having rules and structures that allow dogs to have good lives.
All right, now we're going to the dogs. Or at least, the dog show.
We're about to see the utility group, as Jess says. This group consists of miscellaneous breeds of dog, mainly of non-sporting origin.
One of the reasons Frances brings up dogs, aside from just being a dog lover, is because there is a growing school of thought that the system of breeding show dogs and of maintaining purebred kennel clubs could actually be setting up a perverse incentive. The idea behind having a checklist for what makes the ideal purebred this or that was to make sure the integrity of that breed could be maintained. In order to do that, certain standards were drawn up. That, says Vancouver veterinarian Koharik Arman, could be where things get perverse. She published a paper outlining some of her concerns in the Canadian Veterinary Journal.
The breed standards are very detailed explanations of what the dog should look like specifically, and there are many different physical traits which will exclude them as being competitors. And so basically the incentive to meet these breed standards and just sort of push the envelope further and further is that if you win competitions, then your kennel gets a better name and you can sell your dogs for higher prices, and the more successful your kennel is likely to be. And so ultimately that comes down to economics.
And what kind of effect could those economics be having on Fido and Rover? It has something to do with what those in the dog show set call conformations.
A conformation is just the physical type that the dog has. So there are dogs with long muzzles, and then there are those, for instance, with very short, flat faces, such as bulldogs and Shar-Peis and pugs and Shih Tzus. And so anytime you see these conformational extremes in dogs, it is essentially a disease state that has been created purposefully. So, for instance, dogs like English bulldogs, and you'll see many of those walking around Vancouver here, they are basically bred specifically for defective bone growth, and as a result, they spend lifetimes struggling to eat properly, to drink properly, to breathe well. In fact, they never have an easy breath in their entire life. And that's, really a basic sort of right to be able to breathe comfortably while being alive.
So what she's saying there is the big focus in the dog show world is the physical features of the dog. But to get a dog who fits the code, you may have to breed dogs with internal health problems. So the same incentive to breed a pretty dog can also, perversely, be an incentive to breed an unhealthy dog. Ironic, since the whole point of pedigree dog breeding is to ensure a line of healthy dogs bred to a historical standard. In March of this year, the Crufts Dog Show, which we heard a little of earlier, set tongues wagging. The show was getting a lot of criticism. People said judges were crowning outwardly perfect but internally unsound champions. And so it turned to a bit of market regulation to address the situation. Now, in 15 breed categories, dogs are not just judged on their outward appearance, they're also inspected by an actual veterinarian. That puts the criteria of a healthy dog high on the checklist and helps eliminate the perversity. From an official Crufts video, here's veterinary surgeon Nick Blaney taking a look at Dottie, an English bulldog that lives up to the new standards.
The muzzle is slightly longer than some bulldogs.
Yes, and she can breathe okay?
She can breathe fine. She's been here all day and she's not panted once.
She's not snoring at all.
She's got lovely clear eyes, no signs of entropium.
Yes.
If we go round the back here, you'll see she's got a lovely...
She's got a proper tail.
Proper tail.
Yeah.
Proper perfect tail.
Excellent.
So that is a proper perfect tale of how a little tweaking is sometimes needed to make sure that good incentives don't go bad. I'm Matthew Lazenrider, and this is The Invisible Hand. You can follow us on Twitter at CBC The Hand. Our show today is about perverse incentives and the role they play in economics. Especially in the case of government policies, the stakes can be very high. In California, some people say they may have come down to life or death.
Had the guy that killed my father knew my father for even 5 minutes, he would never, ever have done such a horrific crime.
Earlier, we introduced you to Vanessa Wellington. Her father was murdered by a criminal who'd been in and out of jail. At the time, he was out on parole. He was the kind of person California's 3 strikes rule was meant for. It was meant to send the message, you've had 2 chances, don't cross the line again. On the day Vanessa's father was shot, the man who killed him had been spotted hanging around some parked cars on a university campus. Someone called the police because it looked like he might be trying to break into one of the vehicles. The second officer to respond to the call was Vanessa's dad, Herbert Stovall.
They had an estuary on the college campus, and the suspect jumped into the water to escape the first officer. And my father drove his patrol car around to cut him off as he was coming out of the water. The guy surprised my dad and pretty much, tackled him, and they fell into the water, and they struggled for a moment or two, and then the guy took my father's revolver and shot him twice. By the time the other officer came around to the scene, he had no idea that my father was shot in the water. He just sees the suspect coming out the water. He apprehends him, but there are people who were on the bridge that saw my father's badge, I guess, reflecting in the sunlight. And I guess they were pointing down to the other officer that, there's somebody else in the water, and the officer didn't realize that my father was down.
Economists have studied the 3 strikes laws. Some say the legislation may accidentally have created a perverse incentive. It's one they say could have deadly consequences for people who wear a badge, like Herbert Stovall did. 24 American states have 3 strikes laws. Since they were enacted, the number of police officers murdered each year while in the line of duty has nearly doubled. Some economists have looked at numbers like that and concluded that the law could have added an incentive for criminals on the verge of getting caught a 3rd time to use deadly force. They say it's because the punishment for murder is no more harsh than it would be for a less serious 3rd strike crime. So somewhere along the line, the incentive to not commit a crime became an even bigger incentive to not get caught. The man who killed Vanessa's father told police he was thinking about his 2 previous convictions when the officer tried to arrest him.
The knowledge that he did have 2 strikes against him put him in the frame of mind that this could be my 3rd strike, just put him into panic mode. And he said that he just did not want to go back to jail. That's it's a life-changing decision that he made. It changed our lives, it changed his lives, and the irony of it all is that he ended up going back to jail. My father's gone, and he's in jail for life.
The story of Vanessa's family is just one incident. But in this case, the man responsible acknowledged that his behavior was influenced by the 3 strikes law, a law that was intended to reduce crime and make the community safer. Whatever other successes the law may have had, and that's still an active debate, this example is a story of the perverse incentive it created for this one criminal. Economists and lawmakers will always have an interest in the incentives of crime and punishment. But economist Frances Woolley says it's also part of a bigger discussion, one that's been going on for centuries. The general public may not have been using terms like perverse incentives to talk about these concepts, but the idea is nothing new, especially when it comes to making the punishment fit the crime.
When something is so much common wisdom that it becomes a part of our language, so phrases like, you might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb, that phrase refers to the penalty for poaching, right? So the penalty for poaching was hanging. So the phrase, you might as well be hung for a sheep as a lamb, suggests that, if you're going to be commit an offense for which you might get hung, you might as well steal something big as steal something small. Another expression is make the punishment fit the crime. When ideas are so deeply embedded that they become part of our language, that suggests that maybe there is some truth in it. This all gets back to the history of penal reform, right? That some countries used to have these incredibly harsh penal codes, and they just found that they weren't effective because of these problems that people, if you're going to be hung anyway, you might as well be hung for something worth stealing.
So in the justice system, the manufacturing industry, even the world of animal husbandry, incentives are always present. And when there are incentives, there can be perverse incentives as well. It's the reason economist Frances Woolley started our show today, saying that to her, the study of economics is essentially the study of incentives. They are a powerful tool. They can have a powerful impact on policy, on society, and on individuals.
Whatever structure, whatever rules are in place, people will look and they'll say, okay, what are the choices I have within this framework? And they'll use the framework to get the best lives for themselves. But when lawmakers start believing that people are naive, that people won't take advantage of what they can take advantage of, I think that's the number one mistake that people make is not realizing that people have choices, not realizing that people will respond to choices. And we can't avoid creating incentives. Whatever set of rules we have, whatever policies we have in our economy, those will create incentives. So it's not like incentives are something we can eliminate. We can just try and create good incentives. Incentives for people to do things that make them in the long run happy, as opposed to incentives that create behavior that will be in the long run harmful or destructive.
So they can't be eliminated, and they can be unpredictable. But incentives do have a huge effect on the choices people make every day. If Adam Smith's idea holds true that all of those individual choices add up to an unseen force in the economy, then incentives and perverse incentives are what move the invisible hand. We hope we've provided you some incentive to check out our webpage, to download our podcast, or send us a comment. You can get the information to do all of those things at cbc.ca/theinvisiblehand. You can stay in touch over the next week by following us on Twitter at CBCTheHand. Our show is produced by Jeff Turner. Our economic consultant is Stephen Gordon, and our senior producer is Karen Burgess. I'm Matthew Lazen-Ryder. Next week on The Invisible Hand, he's irrational, selfish, and vain, but we love him just the same. We'll get up close and personal with Homo economicus 2.0.
Looking for more CBC podcasts? Go to cbc.ca/podcasting.